Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're going to explore the life of Benjamin F. McAdoo Jr., an architect whose work I think is as interesting as his life story. And I feel like he's one of those figures who deserves more recognition.
Well, get ready to be amazed because McAdoo's impact goes way beyond just buildings. We're working with excerpts from his Wikipedia page today, and his story gives us a look into a really fascinating period in American history, especially when it comes to social change and how architecture played a part in all that.
Okay, well, I'm intrigued. So let's start at the beginning. McAdoo was born in Pasadena, California in 1920 and grew up in a pretty racially diverse neighborhood, which, from what I understand, was pretty unusual for that time period, especially in California. So I'm curious how that environment might have shaped his perspective.
You're right about that. The diversity he grew up around definitely played a role in how he saw the world. But it was actually in ninth grade when he took a mechanical drawing class that his fascination with architecture really started. And he was also inspired by Paul R. Williams, a really successful Black architect in California at the time. And I think seeing someone like Williams doing so well probably gave McAdoo a sense of, like it was possible for him too.
Yeah, absolutely. Seeing someone who looks like you succeeding in a field you love could be so powerful. But his path to becoming an architect wasn't easy or straightforward. He couldn't afford a traditional architectural education, so he had to juggle work and studies. And then, of course, World War II happened, and he ended up joining the Army Corps of Engineers.
That's right. And you have to think about what was going on back then. We're talking about a time when segregation was still a huge problem in many parts of the U.S., and Black Americans faced so many barriers when it came to education and jobs. Even though California might have been seen as more progressive, in some ways racism was still a big obstacle for him, but he was determined, and after the war, he ended up in Seattle, a city that had a reputation for being pretty tolerant and a booming post-war housing market.
And that move to Seattle was a big turning point in his career. In 1946, he became the first licensed African-American architect in Washington state. That's huge, especially considering everything he had to overcome to get there. Did he face any particular challenges in Seattle because of his race?
It's tough to say for sure what specific obstacles he ran into in Seattle, but you can bet that being the first Black architect in the whole state came with its own set of challenges. I mean, we're talking about a time when racial discrimination was everywhere. And even in a city like Seattle, I'm sure he dealt with a lot of prejudice and people doubting him.
It's definitely something to consider, especially in that historical context. So tell me, what kind of projects did he work on when he first started out? Did he jump right into big buildings or did he start small?
Like a lot of architects, he started with remodels and alterations, which let him get some experience and build up his reputation in the city. But his talent was obvious right away, and he caught the eye of Marjorie Phillips. She was the architecture critic for the Seattle Times, and she became a big supporter of his work, which really helped him get noticed in the Seattle architecture scene.
It's amazing how much a good review can help a young architect. I'm curious about his design style, though. Was he doing something completely new, or was he following the trends of that time?
His designs were rooted in something called the Northwest Regional style, which was all about clean lines, natural materials, and blending in with the surrounding landscape, lots of wood and stone, big windows to bring the outdoors in, and a focus on function and simplicity. This style fit right in with the modernist movement that was happening in architecture all over the world, but McAdoo brought his own unique touch to it.
That's really interesting. It makes you picture those beautiful modern homes nestled in the Pacific Northwest, surrounded by all that nature. But I'm getting the sense that McAdoo is about more than just designing pretty homes for rich people.
You are absolutely right about that. While he designed some amazing homes, he was really passionate about using architecture to make a positive difference in the world, addressing things like making housing affordable and creating inclusive spaces. And that's where we start to see how dedicated he was to using his skills for something bigger than himself. In 1948, he designed and built the Ben Mar apartments. And what made this project so special was that it was open to tenants of all races, which was a bold statement against the housing discrimination that was so common back then.
Wow, that's a powerful example of how architects can use their work to fight for social justice and equality. It really makes you think about the impact a building can have on a community, especially during a time of so much prejudice. Were the Ben Mar apartments considered a success? Did they actually achieve that goal of integrated housing?
They absolutely did, and they became a symbol of how committed McAdoo was to social change through architecture. They weren't just well-designed and functional, but they represented something much bigger, equality and inclusion, at a time when those values were really being challenged.
That's truly remarkable. It makes you wonder if those apartments inspired other architects or developers to do the same thing. But I'm also curious about the House of Merit. I read that it was a design for affordable and easy-to-build single-family homes, and that over 80 of them were actually built.
Yeah, and that shows how much McAdoo believed in making good design accessible to everyone, not just the wealthy. He felt that everyone deserved to live in a well-designed, functional home, no matter how much money they made. And the House of Merit was proof of that belief. It combined affordability with smart design, which was pretty innovative for that time.
He really does seem like he was ahead of his time in many ways. Okay, so we've talked about his early career in Seattle and his commitment to social justice. But there's more to his story, right? He worked on some projects outside of Seattle, even internationally.
He sure did, and his international work is really fascinating because it shows how he thought globally and was willing to take on new challenges. In fact, he even worked for USAID in Jamaica, designing modular homes that were meant to improve living conditions in low-income areas.
With Jamaica, I had no idea about that part of his career. Was that kind of work common for architects at those days?
It wasn't exactly typical, but it shows how willing he was to push boundaries and use his skills to address social problems around the world. He wasn't afraid to step outside of his comfort zone and tackle tough problems. It was in Jamaica that he really started exploring the idea of modular housing, which was a pretty new approach back then.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned he even worked on the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. That's quite a jump from small-scale housing projects to a national landmark.
He did indeed. McAdoo worked on the Kennedy Center under the famous architect Edward Durrell Stone. It's incredible to think about the range of his career, from designing affordable homes in Seattle to working on one of the most iconic cultural institutions in the United States. It really shows how talented and adaptable he was as an architect.
It sounds like he had an amazing journey, and we've only just scratched the surface.
There's definitely a lot more to learn about McAdoo, and I think it's really inspiring that, along with his architectural success, he was also very involved in activism and community work.
That's so cool, and it makes sense with what we've been talking about, his focus on affordable housing and making sure everyone had a decent place to live. It sounds like he was a real force for change, not just in architecture, but in fighting for social justice, too.
Absolutely, and his work with the Seattle chapter of the NAACP is a perfect example of that. He actually served as president of the chapter, which shows how much he cared about civil rights and how much respect he had in the community. It wasn't just about designing buildings for him, it was about making the world a fairer and more equal place for everyone.
Wow, being president of the NAACP, that's a big deal. It shows he wasn't afraid to stand up for what he believed in, even when it might have been controversial. Did he face any pushback for his activism, especially considering the political climate back then?
You have to remember that the civil rights movement was really gaining momentum during this time, and there was a lot of resistance to change, even in places like Seattle that were considered more progressive. I don't know exactly what challenges he faced, but it's safe to say that speaking out about racial equality probably didn't make him popular with everyone, but he didn't let that stop him.
It sounds like he was a man with strong convictions. And on top of his work with the NAACP, he also hosted a weekly radio show. Right, that's such an interesting detail. What did he talk about on his show? Was it all about architecture, or did he get into broader social issues?
His radio show was actually all about discussing racial issues and advocating for social change. It was a way for him to reach more people and have conversations that weren't happening in the mainstream media back then. Think about it, this was when television was just starting out, so radio was still the main way people got their news and information. And he used it really effectively to give a voice to marginalized communities.
That's awesome. It's like he was a pioneer in using media for social justice before social media even existed. It shows how forward-thinking he was and how he knew how to use different platforms to make a difference. But his activism wasn't limited to the NAACP and his radio show, right? Didn't he also run for office at one point?
He did. In 1954, he ran for a seat in the Washington House of Representatives, and his campaign focused on issues that were clearly important to him: civil rights education and fair taxes. He saw politics as another way to make positive change, to influence policy and fight for people who were often ignored or left behind.
It sounds like he was always pushing boundaries, always trying to make a difference in any way he could. And while I admire that, I'm curious, was his political campaign successful?
Unfortunately, no, he didn't win the election, but even though he lost, it still says a lot about who he was and how committed he was to creating a fairer society. He wasn't afraid to enter the political arena and speak up for what he believed in.
That's really inspiring. It makes you realize that even when we don't achieve this specific goal, we're aiming for the act of trying, of putting ourselves out there and fighting for what's right, can be just as powerful. But let's go back to his architectural work for a minute. We've talked about his design style, his dedication to affordable housing, and his international projects. But we haven't really discussed the challenges he faced as a Black architect in a predominantly white profession.
That's a really important point. It's crucial to remember that all of McAdoo's achievements happened during a time of widespread racism and discrimination. Even if he was breaking barriers and getting recognition for his work, he definitely dealt with challenges and prejudices that white architects just didn't have to worry about.
Right, it's easy to focus on celebrating his successes, but we have to remember the obstacles he had to overcome and the societal barriers he had to break through. I mean, even in Seattle, which was known for being relatively tolerant, I imagine he still experienced racism.
Oh, for sure. And one example of that is when he and his family moved to a mostly white neighborhood in Seattle, they actually faced pushback from some of the residents who weren't thrilled about having a black family move in.
That's awful to hear, but unfortunately, it's not surprising given how things were back then. It makes you realize that even in a place like Seattle that prided itself on being progressive, racial prejudice was still a problem. It also makes you think about the personal sacrifices McAdoo and his family had to make to try and have a better life.
It does. And later on, when McAdoo and his family wanted to live in a more rural area, they actually had to move outside of Seattle's city limits. And some people believe that might have been at least partly due to housing discrimination.
That's really sad. It's kind of ironic that a man who dedicated his career to designing housing that was inclusive and accessible might have been a victim of housing discrimination himself. It just goes to show how deep-rooted prejudice can be, even in communities that seem progressive.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always easy or straightforward, and that even when people achieve amazing things, they can still be affected by racism and discrimination. But even with all these obstacles, McAdoo never gave up on his commitment to social justice and using his architectural skills to make the world a better place.
His story is a great example of how powerful perseverance can be, and how important it is to use your voice and your platform to fight for positive change. It reminds us that we all have a responsibility to work towards a fairer and more equal society, and that even small actions can make a difference. Yeah, it really shows you that one person can make a real difference in the world. McAdoo's story is both inspiring and thought-provoking. It makes you want to push for change while also recognizing that there are still so many systemic obstacles out there.
Exactly. And his impact went beyond his own lifetime. Even after he passed away in 1981, his firm kept going for another 20 years under the name McAdoo, Malcolm, and Ewell. They even designed the Des Moines Library, which opened in 1988. It really shows the kind of lasting legacy he built, not just in terms of his design, but also his commitment to making a positive impact.
That's amazing. It's like his vision and his values continued to shape Seattle's architecture even after he was gone. It makes you wonder what else he could have accomplished if he'd lived longer, what other barriers he might have broken, what other communities he might have touched.
It really speaks to his influence and how important it is for us to remember and celebrate architects like Benjamin F. McAdoo Jr., who didn't just create beautiful and functional buildings, but also use their position to fight for social change and challenge the way things were. They remind us that architecture can be a powerful way to create a more just and equal world.
Totally agree. His story is a great reminder that we can all make a difference, whether it's through our work, our activism, or even just by speaking up against injustice. McAdoo's legacy is a call to action and inspiration to use what we're good at and our voices to build a better world for everyone.
Well said. He was a true visionary, always pushing boundaries and challenging the status quo. His work wasn't just about looks or function. It was about creating spaces that reflected his beliefs and his vision for a more inclusive and equitable society.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the life and work of Benjamin F. McAdoo Jr. It's been quite a journey, right? We've gone from his childhood to his architectural accomplishments, his activism, and all the challenges he had to face along the way.
It has been fascinating, and I hope everyone listening has a better understanding of this incredible architect. And the legacy he left behind. His story shows the power of never giving up, the importance of giving back, and how architecture can truly change things for the better.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And before we sign off, I want to leave you all with something to think about. How can architects today follow in McAdoo's footsteps and use design to solve social problems and create more inclusive communities? What can we learn from his approach, his values, and his unwavering commitment to social justice?
That's a great question, one that I hope will make people think and keep the conversation going. McAdoo's story reminds us that architecture isn't just about making pretty buildings, it's about shaping the world we live in and making it a fairer and more just place for everyone.
Perfectly put. And with that, we say goodbye to all our fellow deep divers. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of Benjamin F. McAdoo Jr.'s life and work. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the world around you.
Keep diving.